Okay, hello everyone. So for this episode, we have Miss Sharifah.
Hello.
Miss Sharifah, introduce yourself.
Okay, so thank you, Zell, for the quick introduction there. My name is Sharifah Aino binti Habib Idris, also known as Miss Sharifah. I'm a final year TESOL student teaching English as a second language, taking a bachelor's in education. In terms of background of work or whatsoever, I started community engagement since pretty much 2016, 2017, through various non-governmental organizations. Interestingly, I didn't quite start immediately within language teaching and education. I actually started my journey within a community orchestra, believe it or not, where we empower charity homes um, and marginalized communities to join together through the power of music. Of teaching, because I was an assistant tutor for a group from Batam, a music group from Batam. But other than that, I transitioned slowly into taking up leadership positions in university clubs, clubs within my university before I went into student activism, where I focused more on campaigning and advocacy. But that is in the realms of my extracurriculars. For my degree itself, I just recently finished my practicum. For those of you who are unfamiliar, it's like an internship, but instead of an internship being at a company, it's an internship at a school. So I had my school orientation course last year, which was a very short course, around 2 weeks, at a school in Selangor, whereas my practicum, which is more robust, was longer. That was 3 months at a school in Kuala Lumpur here. So right there, actually, I did quite some focuses on a lot of topics, but my areas of interest within language itself is something more on the lines of like effective filters, nonviolent communication, and critical pedagogy, which I'll be talking about later in the podcast itself. So even though my background in the beginning seems a bit of a stretch away from education and the classroom itself, a lot of the skills that I picked up are transferable, which I'll explain also later on. So yeah, that's briefly who I am.
Okay, thank you, Miss Sharifah, for that impressive introduction. Yeah, so you got a lot on your plate, all right? But yeah, it's quite interesting because you also said whatever you did in the past are transferable to
Oh
what
yeah.
you're doing in the classroom. So we'll explore a bit on that later. So,
Mm-hmm.
all right. So for this episode, since Miss Sharifah, she mentioned about she's currently a final year student of TESOL, teaching English as second language, which means she's undergoing a practicum in a
Mm-hmm.
school. All right. So speaking about this, can you share a memorable moment from your teaching practical experience that had a significant impact on you as an aspiring educator? And what did you learn from that experience?
Ah, well, to start off, I'm quite a sentimental person actually. So I believe that a lot of moments are memorable in their own way. Even the smallest moments, like a very short conversation that you have with a passerby, can be memorable in its own way because of the lessons that it has. Because one thing that I've learned throughout the years of collecting memories from different disciplines and different walks of life is that even though the experience or lessons that you have at that time resonate in one way, but maybe down the line, 5 years down the line, you'll have take away a different message from the same experience. So that's what I believed uh, is happening right now. In terms of memorable moments, I have a few actually that I want to talk about. Number one was definitely when I was doing my school orientation course, which, by the way, it's like a shorter version of a practicum. A practicum is more robust, where you are in charge of multiple classes, where you are teaching or whatsoever. And in my case, I was teaching English, and I was supposed to teach technology as well, ICT or science computer. But unfortunately, the school that I went to already had an abundance of technologies teachers and students, so the demand wasn't high enough to warrant another teacher teaching technology. So I was teaching just English alongside other extracurricular activities. And for the school orientation course that I took last year during my second year, sorry, Uh, I went to a school in Selangor. I would say it's more of a very, it's a very average school if I were to describe it. So this school, I was a teaching assistant essentially, quite different than a teacher. A teacher would, as I would mention, the teacher controls an entire classroom. They get to decide what lesson plans happens and whatsoever, whereas a teaching assistant just assists, like the name implies. So I had the opportunity to assist one of the lessons for my supervisor, and I got to execute this one small worksheet within the classroom. We were doing this essay writing practice in the class, and then I noticed that this particular class, which was of mixed proficiency, I noticed that there was this one student that was very non-reactive, very quiet, almost as if they were in their own world, which intrigued me, of course, because this particular student also sat at the front of the class. So I was in view of this student. And then that particular topic for that worksheet was actually about family structures. Just something simple like, oh, my family, describing your routine with your family. So my mother and my father went here, 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 and here. We would eat breakfast, that type of worksheet, if you're familiar. And for those of you who teach English, that's very, very standard lesson and a standard topic there. But I noticed that a number of students, including this one, was very quiet when it comes to this topic. So then I went ahead and approached these students, and then one of them actually asked, can we use, instead of mother and father, can we use grandparents? Or what if we don't have a mother? Or what if we don't have a father? And that made me think for a while. And I was like, oh, something that's quite typical, or something that I would gloss over as the norm, is something that's not exactly true for every student out there, for every person out there. And that was even more so when I realized that the student in front of me, that quiet student, actually didn't even write notions about their mother and their father. They just wrote about themselves, but not so much of mother and father. And then I found out actually that student actually came uh, from an orphanage, and that took me a while. That took me aback because there was two. I was put in two predicaments. There was two ways I could react to that situation. I could look at that situation and take it personally, and I would see, oh, why is this student not participating? They find my lessons boring, or whatsoever. Or I could have chosen the other route, which I did choose, and express curiosity. And turns out it was something that was even beyond me. It wasn't because of a particular factor that was from me, but it was a factor from that student. That student wasn't able to relate to my lessons because that student had an alternative family structure. So I think that was one of the starts to opening up to alternatives, alternative realities, alternative life for my students. And I explored that more once I went to my practicum. For my practicum itself, actually, uh, within the very first class, what I do is I set expectations, or I set ground rules of how I want to conduct a class and how I expect my classrooms to be conducted. I like to lay it out immediately so that they kind of get a feel of how my classrooms are, so that they know, okay, this is how I generally operate and this is what I expect. So one of the things that I laid out as my ground rule is that I am going to open up discourse on a wide variety of topics, and that includes topics that can be a bit more sensitive and whatsoever. When I say sensitive, it's not necessarily meaning like a topic that can be upsetting, but it's a topic that can be divisive if not, if not managed properly, if not navigated properly. So topics like race, religion, politics, and whatsoever. So I just mentioned in that class, and in both of my classes actually during my practicum, that I was going to open up conversations about these kinds of topics, you know, just to get that critical mind going. And interestingly, within, I think within the first 2 weeks of my practicum, the previous English teacher approached me and said, Sharifah, are you teaching politics in your class? They questioned me. They were like, because we received a question, a concerning remark from one of your students that you were going to teach politics in your class. And I was like, I never mentioned that I was going to teach politics. I was going to open a dialogue regarding topics that are critical, topics that are more, nuanced there, not directly teaching to vote for this, vote for that, or whatsoever. But this kind of alerted me to an underlying need of more nuanced thinking, of looking beyond black and white, of thinking, oh, politics is immediately, or you're teaching people, you're teaching students how to vote for this, vote for that, or this side good, this side bad, whatsoever, when in reality the conversations about politics stretches everything. Governance stretches economy, it stretches emotions, healthcare, education, and it's not just politics, it's every other conversation, even conversation about race. It touches upon every person's lives, even if they don't want to address it. It is something that we feel identity based politics, identity, the conversation about identity is something that has been heavily stigmatized, and it's not something new. It's something that we've always known for anyone who's went through the education system. And yet, there is such a lack of ability to navigate through it because I don't really believe in the rule of prohibition. I believe more in regulation. If you prohibit a conversation that's very critical, that's very important, like race and discrimination, if you prohibit it within the classroom, then you are not allowing a safe space for these dialogues to happen, but you are also potentially contributing to further escalation. What that means is, since the classroom has not been able to provide you with a safe space to navigate it at an educational, at a academic level, you wouldn't know how, my students wouldn't know how to come across these conversations maturely, critically, emotionally, and whatsoever. Instead, they would go for, as I said, black and white thinking rather than very nuanced thinking. So this was definitely something that set the tone for my entire practicum, essentially. Alongside the story from my previous school orientation as well, to encourage these different perspectives within classrooms. But I also mentioned that there comes with boundaries as well. With disagreements, there's also respect there, because disagreements does not entail discrimination. Those are very different matters, and those things I keep very separate, because you can disagree with people. And I even said to my students, you can disagree with me too, I don't mind. Actually, that's good. If you can actually identify, I disagree with the teacher, that means you are thinking, that means you are engaged, you're assessing your own morals, your own values, your own opinions against mine, and that's good. But what is not so good is when you start thinking it's okay, because of our differences, that you hate on another person, or that person warrants violence, or that person deserves to be treated any lesser. That is not okay. That is where I draw the line within my own classrooms. So I think that's definitely the memorable moments I can think about when it comes to nuanced thinking itself. Other than nuanced thinking, I think one other aspect of uh, something that's very significant to me once I was in my practicum is along the notions of the reward and punishment system. Now, a lot of teachers, including myself, we've been taught about the very bread and butter theory of reward and punishment. If you do good, you get reward. If you do bad, you get punishment. That type of notion, which in itself sounds good in theory. But again, when you compare it to black and white, it's basically black and white thinking. There's nuances there. So this particular moment was actually not during my teaching, like directly within classroom, but rather it was during a conversation I had with someone. So I was talking about this particular experience I had in classrooms. I was talking about how, oh, I had an activity, I had a game with my students where if they got the answers correct, I'll give them candy, buy them like all the choki choki, I'll buy them bread, I'll buy them ribena and all, and I'll give them. And then the students that didn't get it, I'll say, oh, it's okay, you have your opportunities next time and whatsoever. So I reward them. And then this one person that I was talking to said to me something that struck me right then and there. It made me reflect immediately. That person said to me, "Oh, so you're training them to receive gula-gula lah, kan?" And if you understand the context of what this person is saying, it's not candy as a reward. Gula-gula here is synonymous to bribery, essentially. That is the notion that immediately caught my mind. I was like, oh my goodness, actually, you know what? Huh, actually, that might be right. You're not completely wrong about it. Because when you look at structures, the structures beyond schools, like structures within government, when you see structures within nations and whatsoever, companies, whatsoever, if you are doing a behavior, like say for example, you're trying to pass a project, and in order to make the project pass faster, what is one thing that people who have pretty wonky moral compasses do? They would probably give some form of compensation or gula gula or some form of bribery. And once once I realized that I was instilling this factor like, oh, okay, I just have to reinforce behavior by giving gula gula or giving choki choki or giving rewards. It's a behavior that can escalate, you know. It looks harmless in the classroom because generally it is, you know, it's to encourage good behavior and whatever. And people or other teachers would think, oh my God, if we don't do this, then how lah? What are we going to do? Are we not going to punish them? Are we not going to say they're doing well? But it definitely made me reflect on the entire notion of the reward and punishment system, actually, of rewarding people with candy, with gifts and whatsoever, because it is something that, as I mentioned, it can escalate. Just imagine if my students, say for example, my students are motivated because of the fact that if they're doing good, they'll receive rewards, they'll receive gula gula, they'll receive choki choki or whatever. What if one day they come to a realization that they don't want to receive just chocky chocky anymore, but they want Toblerone or they want the more expensive chocolates. They want like Haagen-Dazs. Haagen-Dazs is chocolate. I'm not sure, but basically they want these more expensive gifts. What happens then? Do I have to accommodate? That's something that made me think at that moment, and ever since then I've re-examined my approach when it comes to the reward and punishment. Actually, I read a quite interesting book about this. Um, it was a book by a Japanese author. I'm not quite sure. I think it's Ichiro something something. But the book title is The Courage to be Disliked. So within this book, actually, it touches on quite a lot of things because I myself am quite interested in educational psychology, and this book actually covers on one type of psychology, which is Alderian psychology. And in this book, actually, they mention that one must not praise and one must not rebuke. And that was a critique of them towards this reward and punishment system. So rather than one praising or one rebuking person for their actions, what do you do? And that made me reflect as well because when you have this system of saying students like, oh, good job, you know, you're doing amazing or whatever, yes, it does provide them a sort of emotional boost. Who doesn't? I would definitely get emotional boost when people would say good job to me, just as much so. But it only gives the motivation extrinsically. It creates sort of like a dependency or even like a power dynamic actually within it, because you have one person that is assessing and then one person that is receiving there. So it creates almost like a power dynamic here between the person that praises and the person that is receiving the praise. So when you say good job, yes, they know, and at that moment there is a motivational boost, but what do they do afterwards? They're not sure what they do afterwards. What is the behavior that should be moved forward? What behavior moved forward? What behavior should be, de-escalated? What behavior should be minimized? What behavior should be more encouraged? It's very vague, actually, when you say good job or excellent. You're not quite sure. So, one thing that I remember doing more that has impacted me, and also I noticed that it's impacted my students as well, is that rather than saying good job, excellent for your answers or whatever, I prefer to thank them for their answers. Actually, I prefer to say, oh, thank you for that answer, it's very enlightening, we can explore this or whatever. That is the if the answer is something that is actually very fascinating. But if the answer is something that would clash with, or an answer that I would disagree with, then maybe I would say, oh, again, thank you for the answer. I may have a different opinion on this, but again, we can explore further opinions because there are multiple ways we can approach a particular issue or a topic. It's the same thing as rebuking just now. So I think those moments, like, the moments I had last year with finding out that my very own student came from a orphanage, and then having my previous English teacher mentioning about, oh, don't teach politics within classrooms, and even having this my friend mentioning about giving gula gula in the classroom. Those moments actually served a lot of the anchors. It created a lot of anchors in how I taught during my practicum. So yeah, I would say those are the experiences that definitely made a significant impact. It paved the way in how I operated in my classrooms. Yeah.
All right. So earlier you mentioned about setting expectations on how to conduct the
Mhm.
class, and then of course you also mentioned reward and punishment with regards to the things that are most memorable for you. So those two things, they are related to classroom strategies, classroom management. So often it is a challenge for new teachers, particularly for practicum teachers. So can you describe, maybe you've described it earlier, but can you give us more detail on a specific classroom management strategy or technique that you found particularly effective during your practical experience?
Actually, this is a very interesting question, because honestly, I this particular aspect of teaching was very difficult for me to navigate. The lesson planning was relatively doable. The actual lesson execution was doable. Understanding syllabuses, the scheme of work, and whatever, those things are quite doable, and adjusting within the school climate itself. But classroom management is something that I've learned that's very personalized. Even if it would work in, say, for example, my friend's classroom, because when we were sent to do practicum, we were sent in pairs or in groups. So even if my friend's classroom management strategy works for her classroom, it might not necessarily work with mine because it widely depends on what type of students are working in there, what are they motivated by, what are their fears whatsoever. But actually, one thing that did help a lot in empowering my students in general actually is to bring that sense of autonomy to the class itself by not just instructing them to do this and that, but rather collaborating with them to take part in the lessons and setting the direction for the lessons themselves. So one thing that I usually do for my lessons, when I'm planning them out, I would usually have the main activity, whether it's within whether it's in set induction or during the during stage or during the practice stage or whatever. I would usually have the task or the activity, but I would always come up with some alternatives to that task. How can we approach that activity as well? Like, say, for example, in one of the activities that I had, in order to reflect publicly about uh, about our lessons thus far. Instead of, I gave two alternatives. You could either speak, or you could either write it down on a sticky note and then I could read it out. So they could have that alternative to a task, which would still lead to a very similar, if not the same, outcome. And that actually does help in the sense that these students are not just passively, following the instructions of the teacher, but they are actually taking part. They're actually engaging and taking ownership over their own education, which is something that I find very important when I want to teach my classrooms for whatever subject. Yes, I was teaching English, but I think it's also important to that students have that sense of ownership over their own education and their learning in whatever subject that they learn, because the current, well, a lot of us are trained, including I was trained quite a lot to teach from a very teacher centric perspective, from a very teacher focused perspective, way of classrooms. But I want to move away from that type of model, which is actually something close to the banking model of education, which was a term by Paulo Freire, one of the pioneers for critical pedagogy. So, this type of education where we see teachers being kind of like the depositors and students kind of like the bank, or we just bang in money, 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 or in this case bang in information, bang in worksheets, bang in lessons to the students whatsoever, and then they just receive it passively. So I moved away from that. And when students actually develop that sense of responsibility, of knowing that, oh my God, it's not just on the teacher anymore. I'm not just following my teacher. This is something that I get to decide. I noticed that they actually step up and they actually hold themselves and each other accountable more and more. Of course, I'm still experimenting with how it actually manifests within the classroom, but other than providing alternatives to a task, I would sometimes would also ask, okay, so we have two ways or two activities that we can go for in a class. I'm going to gauge everyone. I'm going to ask the class itself, okay, we have two activities we can go for. Do you want to go for this type of activity or this kind of activity today? And once the majority voted for the alternative activity, the likelihood of them participating and being cooperative within the lesson actually increases from what I see. So when they are given that sense of autonomy or responsibility, that's one thing that I see helping quite a lot when it comes to classroom management, because now it's not just the teacher that is there to quiet the students down or whatever, but they are trying to, they are aware of their own, activities, their own behaviors within the classroom. They're aware that they themselves can be disruptive just as much as any other person, and they themselves would, hold each other accountable and be like, hey, let's keep our voice relatively low, or semua tu. So there's that. Once you empower the students to have that sense of responsibility within themselves, that's one. And then another one, very quickly, I think that's very important to mention, is a term that I call sensitization of command. Now this is something that I didn't quite realize until I saw on Instagram. There was this one Instagram reel I was watching. I'm not sure whether it was directly for a classroom setting, but I'm pretty sure it was to work with teenagers and children, people who are in their formative years. Basically, this video showed me hypothetical situation where where this one kid was playing with this game and whatever, and then the authority, whether the parent or the caretaker, was shouting, okay, come on, let's move on to another activity. And only when that particular parent shouted or that caretaker shouted did that child take it seriously. And this is a phenomenon that you see quite commonly within the class, and you also see within the school setting. Actually, students only taking it seriously once a teacher is shouting or teacher is angry, or once their guru discipline is coming around, or once a school management is coming around. And why is it? Why? Why is it happening? Why is it that they only take action, or they take it seriously once there's a burst of emotional energy there? And I realized that it's because they also sense that you are not taking your own words seriously. If you notice, at least I noticed for my case, I was not taking my own words seriously when I said, okay, I will, I will take, I will end this lesson within 5 minutes if everyone is not cooperative or whatever. I am not putting my own weight into my own words. I'm just saying it as is. But I realized that when I actually started doing like, okay, this is what's happening, and I would like this behavior to stop for the sake of a lesson. If not, then I will have to take measures. Only when I just say that one time or a few times, but I just take action immediately, calmly. Most importantly, calmly. I take action calmly. Only then they start taking it seriously. Because now they know, okay, when I say it, I mean it. So it's not only when I'm doing an outburst, only when I'm really physically angry, when I'm visibly angry, am I taken seriously. But I take my own words seriously, even when I'm level-headed, especially when I'm level-headed, and that's very important because once you gain ownership over your own and you gain accountability for your own words within the classroom itself, then will they gain respect. Because this generation, I got into this practicum quite, we didn't really have a long practicum before this. We only had the school orientation program for 2 weeks, but before that, we didn't have a particular practicum session that involves us teaching in the classroom, in an actual classroom. So this was pretty much for a lot of my batchmates as well, the first exposure towards students of this generation. And one thing about this generation is that they understand respect quite differently than perhaps previous generations, including mine. So one thing that I've learned that works within my classroom management is mutual respect there. Once they understand that I respect them as my students and as individuals, I can see that behavior shift. Now that they see that, okay, the teacher also respects me, so maybe I should respect myself and I should respect the teacher as well. So now, once I realize I don't have to resort to shouting, I don't have to resort to escalated behaviors, very visible, perhaps even very triggering behaviors to some students. Once I realize that I don't have to resort to that and I can just calmly go up to a student and be like, hey, I need you to I need you to postpone whatever that you're doing to another time. And then right now we want to collaborate on this particular activity. Once I can just go up to them and say like this. And a very important word is I trust you. Saying that word to them allows them to actually step up, and therefore classroom management becomes way easier. Because again, now the responsibility to maintaining calm, maintaining order within the class is not just on me as the teacher. It's a collective responsibility. It's also the student's responsibility, the entire individual responsibility as well, and perhaps even their friends' responsibility. So I think that definitely helps gaining that sense of autonomy within students to take part for their learning, to take part in their classroom management. So it's not just from the perspective of a teacher, not only the teacher is the initiator and the one that dictates everything, but rather it's a collaboration. Mm.
Interesting, Miss Sharifah. Just now you mentioned about critical pedagogy. All right, and then collaboration, and also students taking ownership. So I believe uh, this is part and parcel of classroom management, but it is also related to teaching methods. And you particularly mentioned about critical pedagogy, and I'm kind of interested in knowing more about that. But as a teacher trainee, you likely had the opportunity to experiment with various teaching methods. and perhaps this includes your mention of critical pedagogy. So, could you highlight one teaching method or approach that you believe made a noticeable difference in your students' learning outcomes? What was it, and why do you think it was successful?
Okay, thank you, Zal, for the question. Actually, critical pedagogy, it just ngam you mentioned about it or highlighted it because for the experimentation of like teaching method and approaches, of course, because I'm technically still within my degree. I'm working on my final year project and whatever. So the all the theories, all the methods, all the strategies are quite fresh within my mind in relative to perhaps a teacher who has been in service for quite a while, because I'm still a pre-service teacher, and if that's the case. So, critical pedagogy essentially encompasses quite a lot of things. Um, of course, one of the pioneers is like who I mentioned just now, Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator. So, critical pedagogy essentially is already implemented or is trying to be implemented within the Malaysian education system already. One of them is seen through the flipped classroom method, where it's not the teachers that are teaching, but rather the students that are teaching their peers. That's one way you can do critical pedagogy. Another way that critical pedagogy can manifest itself is within the selection of the topics itself and how you approach language instruction itself. One of the ways that I incorporated critical pedagogy or really experimenting within my teaching methods is to try grammar in context. So grammar in context teaching for your information and for the information of the listeners as well. Grammar in context teaching is essentially a strategy within language instruction, second language instruction, where you are teaching grammar, which is one of the roots, one of the foundations of language, of course, any language actually, but especially true for English. So you are teaching grammar not just in isolation. And when I say in isolation, you're not just teaching it in sentences, through your worksheets and whatever, but you give a real scenario, or you give a real life scenario or stories or whatsoever, so that they can understand grammar through the lenses of this context as well. So the grammar is not just a set of rules, but it's actually about choice. So rather than you're teaching grammar as only, okay, if you're writing in the past tense, you write it as this. If you're writing in the future tense, you include this particular adverb and whatsoever. No, it's going beyond that. It's making students understand that grammar is making conscious choices about the patterns, the language patterns that you use. So, one of the methods that I used within my own classroom that I think made quite a difference there was to involve making connections between grammatical patterns, like, say, for example, using past simple tense and whatever, and connecting it to the meaning of text, wider contextual aspects such as like genre, audience, subject, and purpose, and maybe the writer's responses to the text and whatsoever, the reader's responses to the text, all of those things. Basically, seeing grammar as not just one component within language, one vital component within language acquisition, but rather seeing grammar as an engine that powers the language, an engine that powers communication in itself. So, how I used it within a class, I think one easy answer would definitely be a particular lesson I had. This lesson, interestingly, was heavily inspired, and by Civically ESL. So, shout out to Azelia as well. This was a particular lesson on laws, about teaching modal verbs using laws. So I had my students come up with a bunch of laws whatsoever using modal verbs, incorporating modal verbs. So they would be separated into countries and whatsoever, fictional countries or real countries. So they are separated into groups, and they are to write laws regarding certain aspects. So I gave them, I think, a few themes. I gave them themes of education, economy, finance, healthcare, I think, and entertainment. If I'm not mistaken, I gave them those themes. So they're going to write a few sentences, or in this case, a few laws, incorporating those model verbs. So, say for example, all students should receive free education. So I would ask them also, what's the difference if I use include if you use the word must instead of should? How, what does it change? How does it change the meaning of this particular law if you were to say all students must receive free education versus all students should receive free education? So this type of teaching actually helps them, I notice that helps them not only understand how each and every word, these seemingly minor changes can influence the entire meaning of the text of whatever that they're writing, be it a sentence, be it a phrase, or an entire paragraph, or even an essay. Not only does it change the meaning, but actually it makes them conscious about their choices. It makes them aware that they're not just throwing out words onto a piece of paper and hoping it makes sense, but those are actual deliberate choices that you use. Choosing the word can versus the word must, choosing the word never versus the word may not. So choosing those, making those conscious, drawing attention to that choice, to that thought process there was very important. And also for the simple fact that it made grammar more fun because otherwise, I remember grammar being taught as just a bunch of worksheets and whatsoever, which is still very important and which I still use definitely. But it's not restricted to only worksheets. So you're not just teaching just grammar just in worksheets. You're taking it into context as well of the wider world of what's going on around them as well. So you're learning how grammar works and you're learning when to use it as well in context. So definitely, that's one of the teaching methods and approaches that I think made a lot of differences in them, because not only do they understand, okay, not only they can recite, okay, kalau future tense works like this, or verbs plus ing or adverbs work like this. Not only are they able to recite that or understand that, but they're able to apply it to their learning, apply it to their essays, to their writings as well. Uh, yeah, that's definitely one of the teaching methods there.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for scaling the lesson plan that I created. Yeah, into your own teaching context. That was very interesting. So yeah, because you taught model verbs, and not only
Mm-hmm.
you taught them of how to use them, but you also get them to they were the ones who explain what are the differences between must and should, and
Yes,
how does it influence the entire meaning of the
yes,
text.
and
And yeah,
that type of thought process is what you want for
yeah,
critical pedagogy, actually.
yeah. So that because essentially the lesson was on laws and laws and creating laws for a country, or for a country or a fictional country, and that I think that entails the kind of country that the students imagine that they want when they try to construct sentences using must and should. And at the same time, doing that activity, they will think about, okay, why do I want this type of law in my country? And so through that lesson, through asking them to be aware, and then also at the same time, so that they will be conscious of their word choices of whether they want to use must or should, they were able to think about, okay, this is the country that I want, but at the same time, why they want to have that kind of country with that type of law. Yeah. So at the same time, it's making grammar fun. Yes, it makes them fun instead of just creating sentences, like
Mm-hmm.
instructing them. Okay, construct sentences using must and should. But at the same time, you divide them into countries, and that makes them uh, creative, creative and imaginative at the same time. Yeah, so that's quite interesting. So when I did that lesson plan in my class, um, I just wanted them to be. My purpose was for them to be to envision a country that they want. You know, a democratic country,
Mm.
and then I assigned prime minister, one prime minister, and then the other were ministers in their group. So I wanted them to become leaders. I mean, like, yeah, they decide who's the leader, they vote in the group, and then in every group they have a prime minister. And then,
Same,
yeah,
same, same, actually.
yeah, but yours was more uh at the end you incorporated this kind of wanting them to ask, like, not ask, think about why they want this kind of law to be in that own imaginary country, you know. So I think that is like um a modification of that lesson plan, which is
Mhm,
quite
mhm,
very, very interesting because you get them to think. Yeah,
mhm.
I will try to use that in my lesson. Yeah, so thank you for giving me that idea. Yeah, yeah. All right.
Okay.
Okay, and then yeah, you also mentioned about flipped classroom being a manifestation of critical pedagogy, which I agree, because critical pedagogy essentially means you don't want as teachers, we don't want to do the banking method, like just
Oh,
delivering and
true.
giving them whatever knowledge,
Yeah,
but they should also construct their own knowledge from their
true.
experience, from their own context, and then yeah, so flip classroom is one of them.
True. If I may add a little bit as well about that, actually.
Yeah.
There's one also very logical reason as to why I want to move away from the banking model of education and having a very teacher-centric classroom. For the simple reason that it's tiring. It's tiring for the teacher to constantly be the one who is making all the decisions in the class of how the classroom is going to pan out, of how every minor decision or this amount of students will go into this class, and this amount of students will go into this group, and so it's tiring of a process. It's a lot of mental load. And for my case, I was fortunate because I was only teaching two classrooms. One of them is a Form 1 class, and the other one is a Form 3 class. So I was teaching relatively like lower form students. But I can't imagine for teachers who are teaching, like my colleagues, my in service teachers, who were teaching like up to four classes a day. I can't imagine them. The amount of emotional and mental load that they have to do if they were to subscribe directly within the very teacher-centric approach of teaching. It's tiring. It's definitely tiring and it's unsustainable. I think just to add a little bit of what my one of my mentors within education, a previous educator, said to me, education or teaching in itself is not really a sprint, it's a marathon. So you want to pace yourself well when you're teaching because it's quite a long haul. It's for the long haul. So that's one thing lah, also.
Yeah, yeah, true. Yeah, so I mean, right now, ever since, like, for me, I've been in the system for about 8 years now, and I do think there is a it's currently trying to move away from that teacher centric kind of instruction. Right now we're focused on student centered. So I believe
Mm-mm.
right now we are aligned with, well, not really completely, but maybe we are trying to uh, go inconsistent with critical pedagogy in a way, not all the time, but in a way. Yeah, that's what I think right now. Okay, and then all right. So yeah, let's talk about role models. I mean, you have your mentor teachers, and also you have your perhaps your lecturers, but I would like to know, many educators find inspiration from their mentors or role models. So, for you, is there a particular teacher or educator who has influenced your teaching philosophy or style? And what valuable lessons did you learn from them?
Of course, I had. I had a few of them. I do have them currently. I would say I would divide them into two categories. One is for general philosophy, and the other one is the teaching style itself. Now, for teaching philosophy, I would definitely accredit it to two particular educators. One of them, should I mention the names actually?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. So one of them is Sir, my previous school principal back when I was in secondary school, named Mr. Lokok Chiang. He was current. I think he was the Pengetua Cemerlang Peringkat Negeri Sabah, if I'm not mistaken, at one point, and I believe he is currently a professional trainer at Help University or something along the lines of that. He's retired already, but he loves being in education so much that he chose to become a professional trainer, a teacher of teachers, so to speak, at Help University currently. So Mr. Loko Chang has inspired me quite a lot. And this was even during the times when I was still a student, not so much educated. I wasn't even pursuing education at that time. But even as a student, he has already inspired me in the way that he conducts himself. He's very gentle, very almost kind of like this. The way I would describe it is this very safe aura, safe yet stern, yet precise aura about him. And I remember very clearly, it's something that I hold on to actually during my practicum, among many other mantras. It was something that he said during a morning assembly, a Monday morning assembly, way, way back when I was in school. He said to everyone, I shall pass this way once. If I can do good, I'll do it now. So it's something that I realized where even if you enter teaching, and no matter where you are, even if you teach, say, for example, the same classroom for a few years, the batch of students that you get will be different. Even if you teach in the same school, the classes that you get, each one of them will be wildly different from each one of them. So it's a different ball game every time. So my experiences with my own peers, my batchmates, are very different. Even though we are all from the education faculty of my university, and we're all going through practicum, and we're all teaching in schools either in Kuala Lumpur and Selangor. Even then, our experiences are very different. Even if we're on the same boat, even if it seems like we're on the same boat. So I used to think this was kind of like an. I used to think to an ultimatum. I used to think, oh, I must do it amazingly every time I teach. I must do it to absolute perfection. I used to think it was like that, but then I realized it was quite unsustainable and honestly quite unfair if I were to think of that towards myself, where I would achieve perfection every time when I teach. But rather, my standpoint now is to focus more on betterment, to allow myself some grace and room for stumbles and errors of improvement of learning. I think rather than aiming for perfection within my teaching, even if I pass this way only once, and even if I can do good and I'll do it now, rather than aiming for that perfection in doing that good, I would rather aim for improvement or for betterment, so long as I'm continuously learning, so long as I'm continuously reflecting over my own teachings and applying what I've taught, applying what I've learned from others, from my own students, from other teachers, from mentors, or from readings and whatsoever. As long as that's there, I think that definitely can work, that mantra there. Other than Mr. Loko Chang, I would definitely credit it to another pair of teachers, specifically these two, named Sir Desmond Sandom, and Sir Aziz. Sir Desmond, I believe he's currently working within Kementerian Pendidikan itself. I think he's with the district office, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't caught up with him in a while, but I believe he's already went to KPM. And for Sir Aziz, the last time I had contact with this particular teacher was when he was still teaching at Sekolah Sukan, Sekolah Sukan. So they were very monumental, and they are very monumental to me because they came into my life as a student during a time when I was in my peak for competitions. I was very much competitive as a student in terms of joining extracurricular activities. I would join this and that, everything under the sun, essentially, if I could. So these two came into my life when I was joining this particular competition, and I advanced to the state level for this particular competition. Sorry. So these two taught me that you can be competitive, but with grace. You can be strict and critical with how you teach and whatsoever, because during the time when they taught me, they didn't teach me English in the class itself. I had another English teacher for that, but they taught me skills in terms of debating, in terms of interviewing, persuasion, whatsoever, in terms of how to present yourself. So they were very strict, of course, and critical, and yet it was never on a personal basis. It was never on a basis where it's meant to bring down. It was meant to empower. So it taught me that you can be competitive, you can be strict, you can be critical without being harsh, without being aggressive. And that was something that I wanted to explore very much within my own teachings. You can be direct, but it does not mean that you are harsh. And that's something that definitely influenced my teaching style and philosophy within my uh, practicum journey, actually. These two particular teachers, because they're very result driven people, wonderful, wonderful people, and wonderful educators as well. They're very result driven people, and at that time I was very result driven too. So that made a very interesting combo at that time. In terms of teaching style in itself, I would accredit it to two particular teachers or lecturers that I had specifically during my foundation years. For context, for everyone who is listening, I took a foundation in TESOL as well, teaching English as a second language. This is the same as my degree. So these two lecturers were my TESOL lecturers, Madam Nagamani and Miss Umu. So Madam Nagamani was pretty much an eye-opening lecturer, very eye-opening lecturer, because she introduced me to the concept of alternate thinking, of having diverse opinions without obstructing one another, without condemning or discriminating one another. She opened up that possibility to me, that it is possible to have a classroom where you disagree with one another and yet you are able to respect one another, because the way she taught in our classes or in our lectures at that time, she was my literature uh, lecturer at that time. So whenever she would introduce, like, say for example, a topic, okay, can money buy happiness or whatever. So even if two students in the same lecture were to say, oh, one says yes and one says no, she would always ask why. Why? That simple question of why is so powerful, and it invites so much dialogue there that I found myself doing that in my classroom too. Whenever students say something that seems to be common sense, like, say for example, oh, you should respect your parents, or you should respect your teacher, and I would just turn to them and ask why. Why? Is it possible to not respect your teachers? Why, who says that you have to respect your teachers? Just throwing those ideas, challenging the preconceived notions, and inviting them to inspect back. Why do they think the way that they do? What dictates and what forms their vision or their understanding of what is right and what is wrong? Those things, definitely. That was one thing that I taught, that I learned from Madam Nagabani's style, that very discourse like style, in a very safe environment too. So even if a person, bear in mind, in one of my classrooms actually, there was one person believed who believed in two, actually a pair of my students, that have opposite end morals. They have believed in opposite things in the class, and they would frequently debate one another actually in my class. So there was two of them, and yet they're able to coexist in my class and have discussions in my class because I hopefully I created this safe space for everyone to discuss their ideas, to have their ideas questioned, to have their ideas challenged, and then developed further, nuanced even further. As for Miss Umu, my other lecturer that inspired me, she taught me very interesting subjects there. It was the harder subjects. I definitely remember it was the more like, research type subjects. Miss Umu may rather than a particular teaching style, she did something to my class and I did that for my class too. So it was a continuation. So what happened was during the last day of the class, she gave us pens, and it's not just any pens, but she gave us pens with our names and an adjective on there. And that adjective was an adjective that she wrote down and took note of during the very first lecture that she had with us. During the very first lecture, she asked us what adjective describes us best based on our initials. So my initial is an S, S for Sharifah. So say for example, if I were to say strong-willed Sharifah, so she would actually make that pens to write out as strong-willed Sharifah, and she would give those personalized gifts to each and every one of her students. And I found that wonderful, and I still keep that pen to this day, the one that she gave me. That was years ago. And I did the same thing for my classes, both of my classes, all 50 something of my students. I gave each one of them, I assign them like an adjective based on what I've observed and what I've seen they highlight about themselves. And then I gave them as sort of like prayers or manifestations for them. So there was that, definitely. So, in general, from all of these four educators that I took inspiration from, I developed I would say, this more discourse like still serious. I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as very bubbly in the class. I don't think so. But definitely more more eye-opening lessons and whatsoever in having the opinions of the students. Definitely those things. Mm.
Okay, thank you for that. So you stated about two types of educators or lecturers that have inspired you.
Mhm, mhm.
So the first one is based on general philosophy, and then the second one is based on
Teaching
teaching
style itself.
styles. Yeah, yeah. So those are quite interesting because you remember your past teachers and your current lecturers in terms of how they have influenced you in your general philosophy in education and also your teaching style. So, in relating to this, general philosophy or your teaching style, or maybe in just your journey in education in general. So, looking ahead, what are your aspirations and goals as you continue your journey in education? How do you envision your impact on the lives of students and the education community in the future?
Oh, that is a very big question there. Well, the very first step that I want to take when it comes to my aspirations and goals when I pursue education in whatever capacity, whether that means an in service teacher teaching in government schools or private schools, whether that means a tutor in a language center, or even as a trainer in community centers, in PPRs or whatever. I think one of the main things that I do want to achieve is to make thinkers or make more students think more nuanced, dealing less with absolutes. Because I think with the way that social media has been portraying the news whatsoever, you can find yourself in a very tribalist and very absolutist mentalities where, oh, if they are not with us, they're against us. That type of mentality. But the reality of life and the reality of human nature in itself is that it's very complex, very nuanced. So define our own selves and our own experiences and existence within boxes, clear cut, clear defined boxes, would be a disservice to our own experiences, would be denying our own humanity. So I definitely want to include or try to develop more learners with more nuanced thinking. And when it comes to nuance itself, actually within the education system, there's definitely this manifestation here. In the most obvious sense, it is differentiated learning, where you have learners who have different needs, who have different strengths, different weaknesses, different interests, and you cater towards them. Before this, the teacher again kind of sets everything, and the teacher would be like, okay, we are all going to learn writing and doing individual writing, and that's it. So everyone has to do individual writing without taking into account of individual interests. But differentiated learning is trying to do the opposite, right? So that is one step that I can do in order to encourage more nuance in thinking, because in order to create nuanced thinkers, they have to have a blueprint. They have to have an anchor, a visualization of how nuance can work. And that includes within my own instruction. So, for certain students, maybe perhaps they are more comfortable with writing out their thoughts rather than speaking them out. So, I provide that alternative. Say, for example, another case, I noticed this quite late within my practicum. I noticed how there were some students that were definitely neurodivergent, definitely some students who had different approaches when it comes to learning, different educational needs, and that also includes students who are perhaps on the spectrum. And I think if I could go back and do something about those students, I would definitely invest in tools, educational tools that helps them to learn better, to helps them to learn in a way that they understand themselves. So whether that means buying fidget toys for those students or buying aids for that students, I would consider actually investing in those things if I were to enter, either if I were to go back in my practicum or if I were to be an in-service teacher. I would actually consider investing in those toys, fidget toys, and those learning aids whatsoever. So again, it's being able to highlight to students that hey, your existence is not just a student, but you are indeed a student with very interesting needs, very different interests, very different approaches when it comes to learning, giving that nuance there. So from there, they're able to develop that nuance. And another thing I want to take away for my educational journey is developing that critical pedagogy as well, trying to assimilate critical pedagogy for whatever role, whether that means that they want to become leaders, whether to train my students to become leaders or to train my students to become better friends, to become better communicators, whatever that means. Critical pedagogy can manifest in many other ways. It's not just in the way that you are training them to become leaders, because the reality is, even if every student has the ability to become leaders, they don't necessarily want to become one. And whether or not I, as the teacher, want to push them towards that direction, that is another conversation. But on the student side, perhaps they are not inclined to become leaders, even if they have the ability. But nonetheless, critical pedagogy is able to help the students in problem solving and collaboration and communication and synthesis and whatsoever. So this is definitely something that I want to continue incorporating as well, and definitely refining more as I venture into education, either as whatever role that I take on. Because I think it's quite concerning that the Ministry of Education in itself only introduced HOTS, or concept of higher order thinking skills, or kemahiran berfikir aras tinggi, in the educational blueprint that was introduced in 2013. I think it's quite concerning that it was introduced only then. Of course, there are other reiterations of it previously, of course, but a clear cut concept that is meant to introduce critical thinking and critical pedagogy is only done in the 2000s, 2010s. That's very concerning because what does that say about our education previously, prior to 2013, prior to 2000s? What does that say about our education? So, number one, nuance. Number two, critical pedagogy. And number three, when it comes to my actual goals as I continue this journey here, it really depends because I would love to continue working within the education field and the larger advocacy field, considering my background. My background has not purely been within education, I've been in activism and advocacy as well. So, as much as I do have interest within academia and engaging in research and whatsoever, I do have a stronger inclination towards fieldwork and being on the ground. So, I hope that wherever I may go after this will also align with that, being on the ground, being in the community itself. As for how I envision the lives of students, the impact that I have on the lives of students and the education community itself, I would say I want to create a generation that is more critical, yes, attentive, yes. And in order to achieve that, that incorporates patience. So not only are they critical and they're attentive, in order to achieve that in the first place, they must be patient. Patient in their own learning, patient in their own understanding of themselves and understanding of people around them and towards the system. So creating a generation that's more towards those patient, critical, attentive. Of course, it's a very long way to go in order to really do this and impact my students in that capacity. It's a long way to go. And I was fortunate enough that during my practicum, I did manage to somewhat impact my students there from their own feedback. But it's I still have a long way to go. A long way, very long way to go, and I'm developing my final year project as well. But I definitely hope to see more students, more teachers as well, that are more critical, patient, and attentive to everything around them as well. So I hope to, for my case, on a personal basis, I hope to integrate my own skills from my multiple disciplines that I've been through in the classroom itself. Again, as I mentioned, transferable skills here and there, because I see some skills that I picked up during my time in activism, like say for example, in terms of campaigning, that can manifest as expert as good presentation skills, or in terms of, like say for example, statement drafting, that can manifest in terms of essay writing or in terms of speech writing. So those types of skills integrated within the classroom, if I were to return within the classroom itself. But of course, it's not just my journey. I see that a lot of my friends from different disciplines, my friends who are social activists, political activists, friends who are within the impact industry, embarking within education does bring a lot of hope. It makes me feel that I'm not the only one who's doing this. I'm not the only one who's advocating for critical pedagogy, as the country, as the nation itself is shifting towards critical pedagogy. Of course, also, if the road was easier, I understand that more people would take it if the road was easier. And the challenges and the aversion towards this shift is there, but it's part of the process. It is part of changing an entire system, an entire institution that makes up society, our society, and pretty much every other society. So yeah, I would say that is my envisions. That is what I envision for my impacts for my students and for education community.
Thank you, Miss Sharifah, for sharing your aspirations and goals. We at Hive wish you all the best in your future endeavors.
Thank you.
So what you shared here, you wanted to teach about more nuanced thinking
Mm-hmm.
with among your students, and then also, of course, critical pedagogy, which I really like what you mentioned, and also be more involved on the ground. I believe, like for me personally, being on the ground has not much more impact than those at the top, but it's a different kind of impact that
Yes,
yeah,
it's a real time impact. The thing
yeah,
about being on top or being within research or being within academia is that it will take some time for those changes to reach them. Whereas if you're on the ground, you see it in real time.
yeah, yeah, true. This is not to say that one is more important than the other one. Both have a significant impact, but the
Mm,
different, but it's a different type of impact that
of
we
course,
want to see directly. Yeah, like
of
for
course.
me, I agree with what you said regarding wanting to be on the ground. That's why I'm still teaching in schools. Yeah,
Yeah, actually, that's been my major grievances or major contemplations as to entering education. On one hand, being within the NGO sphere or advocacy sphere for education and working with schools in terms of collaborating for programs seems nice, but it's definitely a different experience being an in-service teacher. So I have been contemplating back and forth, where do I go once I graduate?
all right, so I think we can, yeah, thank you for that, for sharing. Like I think it's about an hour more of a sharing session,
Oh my god.
but it's very
I've
fruitful.
been
I really like what you said, especially in terms of, like you mentioned, thinking about reward and punishment and the notion of praises, and then
Mhm.
sensitization of command. That is a new thing that I learned. And then the grammar in context, which is very interesting, and of course, critical pedagogy. So let's end the podcast here. To all the listeners out there, I hope you have learned a thing or two coming from the perspective of a teacher trainee. And to all the teacher trainees out there, I hope all of you can take inspiration from Miss Sharifah herself. And to all the teachers out there, in service teachers, such as myself, for me, I have, of course, even though she is not in service yet, but I think I've learned a lot of new things from her, coming from her, even though she's
Mhm.
only been teaching practicum for about 3 months. Was it 3 months?
Yeah, 3 months. And that's the beauty of education actually. We learn from one another.
Yeah, so I've learned a lot. So thank you for agreeing to be on this podcast. This is me, Zell, and Miss Sharifah. Would you like to say anything else?
All right. So thank you so much, everyone, to listeners. I hope that you have, even if it's just one takeaway, one minor takeaway from this, that is more than enough. You don't have to learn the entire podcast itself. But if there's even one thing that you can extract, that is already doing a great service to this podcast itself. So stay tuned to the next episodes from Ruang Didik, I would say. And thank you so much, Zell and the team, for inviting me to be on this podcast.
Yeah, and thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye bye.